I was standing in my backyard holding a cup of coffee when I first noticed the construction crew tearing down my tool shed, and my brain couldn't quite process what my eyes were seeing. "Hey!" I shouted, running across the grass. "What the hell are you doing?" A burly man in a hard hat looked up from his clipboard, squinting at me in the morning sun. "HOA approved project, sir. We're putting in additional parking for the community." "That's my tool shed you just demolished," I yelled, pointing at the pile of splintered wood that used to house thousands of dollars worth of equipment. "On my property," the man frowned and checked his paperwork. "Says here this is common area lot 47B. I'm lot 47. That's my backyard. My property line extends another 15 feet past where my shed was." I was shaking now, adrenaline flooding my system. My grandfather's tools had been in there, my woodworking equipment, everything. The construction foreman pulled out his phone and made a call. Within 10 minutes, a silver Mercedes pulled up to the curb, and out stepped Brenda Morrison, the HOA president. She was exactly what you'd expect. Mid-50s, blonde highlights that looked almost white in the sun, designer athleisure wear, and an expression that suggested she'd just smelled something unpleasant. "Mr. Jamison," she said, not bothering with a greeting. "There seems to be some confusion." "No confusion, Brenda. Your construction crew just destroyed my property, my tool shed that was firmly on my land." She pulled out her own tablet and tapped at it with perfectly manicured nails. "According to the community plat map filed with the HOA, this area is designated for community use. We sent out notices 3 weeks ago about the parking expansion project. I never received any notice, and that plat map is wrong. I have my property survey from when I bought the house 2 years ago. That shed was well within my property boundaries." Brenda's smile was condescending. "Perhaps you should check your spam folder. Regardless, the project is approved and moving forward. If you have concerns, you can file a complaint at the next HOA meeting. My shed is already destroyed. My tools are buried under your rubble. As I said, file a complaint." She turned to the foreman. "Continue with the project." I stood there, stunned, as the crew began spreading gravel over what remained of my shed. This couldn't be legal. It wasn't legal. But Brenda was already getting back in her Mercedes, phone pressed to her ear, completely dismissing me. I went inside and immediately started searching for my property documents. I found them in my file cabinet. The original survey, the property deed, everything. The tool shed had been 12 feet inside my property line. There was no question about it. I called my real estate attorney, Mitchell Sanders, the same guy who'd handled my house purchase. He answered on the third ring. "Mitchell, I need help. The HOA just demolished my tool shed and they're building a parking lot over it." "Wait, slow down. What happened?" I explained everything while watching through my back window as the construction crew continued their work. They were moving fast, clearly trying to get as much done as possible. "You have your property survey?" Mitchell asked. "Right in front of me. Take photos of everything. The construction, the debris from your shed, everything. Don't touch anything. I'm going to file an emergency injunction to stop the construction. Can you get to my office in an hour? I'll be there in 30 minutes. I spent the next 15 minutes documenting everything with my phone. Photos, videos, measuring the distance from my back fence to where the shed had been. I even found a few pieces of the shed that hadn't been completely destroyed, including a section with my house number painted on it that I'd put there for identification. The construction foreman watched me with growing concern. "Sir, you're going to need to stay clear of the work area." "This is my property," I said, not stopping. "I'm documenting the destruction of my personal property." He got back on his phone, probably calling Brenda again. I drove to Mitchell's office in downtown Phoenix. my hands gripping the steering wheel too tight. I'd moved to this neighborhood in Scottsdale because it seemed nice, quiet, good property values. The HOA had seemed reasonable when I bought in. Monthly fees weren't too high. They kept the common areas maintained, no major drama. But I'd heard the stories. Everyone has HOA horror stories. I just never thought I'd be living one. Mitchell's office was in a modern building near Camelback Mountain. He met me in the lobby, already pulling on his suit jacket. "Show me everything," he said, leading me to a conference room. I spread out my documents and pulled up the photos on my phone. Mitchell examined everything carefully, making notes on his legal pad. "This is pretty clear-cut," he said after several minutes. "Your survey definitively shows the shed was on your property. Did they have any permits? I don't know. They just showed up this morning and started tearing it down." "Okay. First thing, we file for an immediate temporary restraining order to stop construction. Then we're going to need to get a new survey done by a licensed surveyor to verify the current property lines. After that, we're looking at property damage, trespass, potentially conversion of your personal property. How long will this take, the TRO? I can have that filed within the hour, getting it approved, if we're lucky, by end of business today, but realistically probably Monday." It was Friday. I looked at Mitchell in disbelief. "They'll have the entire parking lot done by Monday." "I know. I'm going to do everything I can to expedite this. In the meantime, do not interfere with the construction. I know it's your property, but if you physically try to stop them, they could call the police and it gets messy. Let me handle this legally." I didn't like it, but I nodded. Mitchell was already on his phone, calling his assistant, setting things in motion. I went home to find the construction had progressed significantly. They'd cleared a much larger area than just where my shed had been and were now pouring concrete. My entire backyard was being consumed. My phone rang. It was my neighbor, Tom Rodriguez. "Quincy, what the hell is going on?" "They just told me they're extending the parking lot through part of my yard, too. They destroyed my tool shed this morning, Tom. I've got a lawyer working on it. This is insane. I specifically bought this house because of the large backyard. Maria wanted space for her garden. Get your property survey and call my attorney, Mitchell Sanders." I gave him the number. "He's filing an injunction. I'm calling him right now." Over the next few hours, I received calls from 3 more neighbors on my street. The HOA's parking lot expansion was eating into multiple properties. We weren't just dealing with an isolated incident of bad record keeping. This was systematic. By 5 o'clock Friday evening, Mitchell called me back. "Bad news. The judge won't hear the TRO until Monday morning." I tried for an emergency hearing, but he said it's a civil property dispute, not an actual emergency. "My property is being destroyed right now. I know, I'm sorry. I tried everything. Monday at 9 a.m. we'll be in court." I've also been contacted by 4 of your neighbors who are in the same situation. I'm representing all of you. This is going to be a bigger case than I initially thought. What do I do until Monday? Document everything. Take photos every few hours. Keep a log of what they're doing and when. Do not engage with the HOA or the construction crew beyond what's necessary. And Quincy, start making a list of everything that was in that shed and its value. We're going to need that for damages. After I hung up, I went back outside. The construction crew was packing up for the day. The concrete had been poured over a large section of my backyard and was already setting. My shed was completely gone, buried under several tons of concrete and gravel. I spent Friday night making lists. The shed itself had cost $8,000. It was a custom-built structure, not some cheap prefab from Home Depot. Inside had been my grandfather's tool collection, which I conservatively valued at $15,000. Some of those tools were antiques, irreplaceable. My own woodworking equipment, power tools, hand tools, probably another $12,000. Lumber I'd been storing, various hardware, my workbench, everything. I was easily looking at $40,000 in losses, and that was being conservative. Saturday morning, I was woken up at 7 a.m. by construction noise. They were back, working weekend hours to finish the project. I took my phone out and started recording again. By Saturday afternoon, the parking lot was taking real shape. They'd poured concrete over what had been 6 different backyards, created parking spaces with painted lines, even installed those concrete parking bumpers. It was a professional job, which somehow made it worse. This wasn't some fly-by-night operation. This was a planned, organized destruction of private property. Tom came over Saturday evening. We stood together at my back fence, looking at the parking lot that had consumed our yards. "Maria's in tears," he said quietly. "She had roses planted along our back border. Some of them were from her mother's garden in New Mexico. You can't replace that." "I had my grandfather's tools," I said. "He was a carpenter, built houses in Chicago for 40 years. When he died, his tools came to me. Now they're under 6 inches of concrete. What kind of HOA does this?" "The kind that thinks they're above the law." Sunday morning, I received an email from the HOA. It was a bill for $500, my assessed contribution to the community parking expansion project. I stared at it in disbelief. They destroyed my property, and now they were billing me for the privilege. I forwarded it to Mitchell with a subject line that was just question marks. He called me 10 minutes later. "Don't pay it. This is actually good for us." It shows they believe this was a legitimate HOA project, which means they are acknowledging responsibility. Save that email. They sent bills to all the affected homeowners. I'm getting copies from your neighbors now. "Quincy, I think we're looking at more than just a property dispute. This might rise to fraud, depending on what we find." "What do you mean?" I did some digging. The HOA board approved this project back in February, but the property records they used were from 2003, before the development was fully built out. The current plat map, the one on file with Maricopa County, clearly shows these are private yards, not common area. Someone either made a massive mistake, or they deliberately used old records to justify this project. Why would they do that? I don't know yet, but I'm going to find out. See you in court tomorrow morning. I barely slept Sunday night. I kept thinking about my grandfather's tools, imagining them buried under concrete like some kind of cursed archaeological site. He taught me woodworking when I was a kid, patient and methodical, showing me how to feel the grain of the wood, how to choose the right tool for each job. Those tools were my inheritance, my connection to him. And Brenda Morrison had buried them like trash. Monday morning, I put on my best suit and met Mitchell at the courthouse. Tom and the other affected neighbors were there too. We looked like we were attending a funeral, which I supposed we were. A funeral for our property rights. The hearing was in front of Judge Catherine Palmer, a woman in her 60s with sharp eyes and no patience for nonsense. The HOA was represented by their attorney, a slick-looking guy named Garrett Hughes, who had the demeanor of someone who thought he'd already won. Mitchell presented our case first, laying out the facts clearly. The property surveys, the photos of the destruction, the documentation that the shed and affected areas were clearly on private property. He had a licensed surveyor there who testified that yes, the HOA had built on private land, and no, there was no ambiguity in the property lines. Garrett Hughes argued that the HOA had acted in good faith, based on the records available to them, that proper notice had been given, and that the parking expansion was for the benefit of the community. Judge Palmer cut him off. "Counselor, good faith doesn't give you the right to build on property you don't own. Did the HOA verify the property lines before beginning construction? Your Honor, they relied on the plat map in their possession. Did they verify it against county records?" A pause. "I'm not certain." "Did they obtain permits from the city?" Another pause. "The HOA maintains that, as a planned community, they have the authority to make improvements without city permits for internal projects." Judge Palmer looked at him over her glasses. "They poured concrete over 6 residential properties without permits. Counselor, do you understand how concerning that is?" She granted the temporary restraining order immediately, halting any further construction. She also ordered the HOA to preserve all records related to the project and scheduled a full hearing for 3 weeks out. As we left the courtroom, Brenda Morrison was waiting in the hallway. She stepped directly into my path. "I hope you're pleased with yourself," she said. "That parking was desperately needed for the community. Now everyone will suffer because of your selfishness." "You destroyed my property," I said, keeping my voice level. "You built over my grandfather's tools, my shed, my yard, without permission, without even verifying you had the right to do it." "We had every right. The HOA owns that land. The county records say otherwise. So do 6 property surveys. So does the judge who just granted the restraining order." Her face flushed red. "You're going to regret this. There are other ways to make your life difficult, Mr. Jamison. HOA violations can add up quickly." Mitchell stepped forward. "Madam, I'd strongly advise you not to threaten my client, especially not in a courthouse hallway where there are multiple witnesses." Brenda glared at him, then turned and walked away, her heels clicking sharply on the marble floor. "That was a threat," Tom said. "You all heard that, right?" "I heard it," Mitchell said. "And I'm making a note of it. Quincy, if the HOA starts hitting you with frivolous violations, document everything and send it to me immediately. That could constitute retaliation, which is illegal." Over the next week, the HOA was eerily quiet. No violations, no communications, nothing. It was the calm before the storm, and I knew it. Mitchell called me the following Monday. "You need to see this. Can you come to my office?" I was there in 40 minutes. Mitchell had papers spread across his conference table, and his expression was grim. "I got the HOA's financial records through discovery. Quincy, this is worse than we thought." "How?" "The parking lot project cost $420,000. The HOA's annual budget is about $300,000 total. They don't have that kind of money." "So where did it come from?" "That's the interesting part. 3 months ago, the HOA took out a loan against the common area property, using it as collateral. But here's the thing. To get that kind of loan, they had to significantly overstate the value of the common area. And the way they did that was by including property that wasn't actually common area. Our yards." "Exactly. They fraudulently represented private property as HOA-owned common area to secure a loan. That's not just a civil matter anymore, Quincy. That's fraud. That's potentially criminal." I sat down heavily. "So what happens now?" "Now I contact the district attorney's office. This is beyond a simple property dispute. The HOA board knowingly committed fraud to secure financing. They falsified property records, and then they used that money to build on property they didn't own, destroying personal property in the process." "Will they be arrested?" "Possibly. That's up to the DA. But at minimum, they're looking at serious civil penalties, and the board members could be personally liable for the damages." "Good." Mitchell looked at me carefully. "Quincy, I need to warn you. This is going to get messier before it gets better." When people face criminal charges, they get desperate. Watch your back. He wasn't wrong. 2 days later, I came home to find a notice on my door, HOA violation for unapproved exterior modifications. They'd cited me for a crack in my driveway that I was pretty sure had been there when I bought the house. Fine, $500. The next day, another notice. My garbage cans were visible from the street after trash pickup. Fine, $300. The day after that, my mailbox was cited for being the wrong shade of black. Fine, $400. I photographed each notice and sent them to Mitchell. He filed a harassment complaint with the court, arguing retaliation, but the HOA didn't stop. They cited me for having my car in the driveway overnight, even though that had never been a rule. They said my front yard grass was a quarter-inch too tall, even though I'd had it mowed 3 days before. They claimed I was running a business from my home because a delivery truck had been seen at my address. Never mind that it was just an Amazon delivery. The fines were adding up to thousands of dollars. Tom and the other affected neighbors were getting hit with the same barrage of violations. It was psychological warfare, trying to break us down, make us give up. Judge Palmer was not amused. At a hearing 2 weeks later, she looked at the stack of violations and her expression darkened. Mr. Hughes, your clients have issued 63 violations to the plaintiffs in a 2-week period. Prior to this lawsuit, these homeowners had a combined total of 0 violations in years of residency. Would you like to explain this pattern? Garrett Hughes shifted uncomfortably. Your Honor, the HOA board has been conducting a comprehensive review of community compliance. These violations are legitimate concerns. All of them against the plaintiffs in this case, none against other residents. Counselor, this is textbook retaliation. Your Honor, I can assure you that's not the case. Judge Palmer wasn't buying it. All fines issued to the plaintiffs are suspended pending resolution of this case. Furthermore, the HOA is prohibited from issuing any new violations to the plaintiffs unless there is clear, documented evidence of legitimate violations, reviewed and approved by this court first. Do I make myself clear? Yes, Your Honor. Because if I see this pattern continue, I will hold your clients in contempt and possibly pursue sanctions against the HOA board personally. The violations stopped after that, but Brenda Morrison found other ways to make her displeasure known. She organized a community meeting to discuss the lawsuit that's destroying our neighborhood. She sent emails to all residents claiming we were trying to bankrupt the HOA and ruin property values for everyone. Some neighbors bought into it. I started getting dirty looks at the mailbox. Someone egged my car. Another person left a note on my windshield calling me selfish and greedy, but others reached out with support. An older couple 3 streets over brought me a casserole and told me to keep fighting. A young family offered to testify about similar HOA overreach they'd experienced. A retired attorney who lived in the neighborhood contacted Mitchell and offered to help with research pro bono. The community was splitting into factions, and the HOA board was on the wrong side of a growing divide. Meanwhile, Mitchell's contact with the district attorney's office was bearing fruit. An investigator came to interview me, asking detailed questions about the timeline, the construction, what I'd been told. They interviewed my neighbors too, and they subpoenaed additional HOA records. The full hearing was scheduled for early December. As that date approached, the HOA made a settlement offer. They'd pay for the damages to the shed and tools, they'd restore our property lines, and they'd reduce everyone's HOA fees for the next year. Mitchell advised me to reject it. They're trying to avoid the criminal investigation. If you settle the civil case, it makes it harder for the DA to pursue charges. Plus, Their offer doesn't come close to covering actual damages. How much should we ask for? Your actual losses are around $40,000. But you're also entitled to the diminished property value, the cost of restoration, and given their pattern of harassment and retaliation, punitive damages. I'm thinking we should counter at $200,000 for you, with similar amounts for your neighbors based on their individual damages. They'll never pay that. Maybe not. But we have leverage now. The criminal investigation, the fraudulent loan, the falsified records. The board members are looking at potential jail time. Their insurance company is probably panicking. The counter-offer was rejected within an hour of submission. Brenda Morrison called me directly, which was a mistake on her part. $200,000. Are you insane? For a glorified storage shed, for the property you destroyed, for my grandfather's irreplaceable tools, for the harassment and retaliation, for committing fraud to finance your pet project. We didn't commit fraud. The district attorney seems to think otherwise. How's that investigation going, Brenda? She hung up on me. The hearing in December was scheduled to last 3 days. Day 1 was presenting evidence. Day 2 was testimony. Day 3 was closing arguments. Mitchell had prepared meticulously, with exhibits, expert witnesses, documentation of everything. The courtroom was packed. Word had spread through the neighborhood, and people wanted to see how this played out. Some were there to support the HOA, but more were there supporting us. Mitchell opened by projecting a satellite image of the neighborhood on a screen. He showed the before and after, the 6 backyards that had been consumed by concrete. Your Honor, this isn't a case about a simple property dispute or a misunderstanding over boundary lines. This is a case about a systematic abuse of power by an HOA board that put their desires above the law, above property rights, above basic decency. And when they were challenged, they engaged in a campaign of harassment and retaliation designed to silence the victims of their illegal actions. He walked through the timeline methodically. The HOA board meeting in February where the project was approved. The loan application in March that used fraudulent property valuations. The construction in September that destroyed private property. The retaliation that followed. He brought up the surveyor again, who confirmed with GPS precision that the parking lot encroached on private property. He brought up an appraiser who testified about the diminished property values. He brought up a contractor who estimated the cost to remove the parking lot and restore the properties. Then, it was my turn to testify. Mitchell walked me through that Friday morning when I first saw the construction crew. Can you describe what you felt when you saw your shed being demolished? He asked. Disbelief at first, like it couldn't be real. Then panic because I knew my grandfather's tools were in there. Then anger when the HOA president showed up and basically told me too bad. Tell the court about your grandfather's tools. I took a breath. This was the hard part. My grandfather, Robert Jamison, was a union carpenter in Chicago. He worked on buildings all over the city for 40 years. When he retired, his tools were his pride. He maintained them perfectly, passed them down to my father, and my father passed them to me. Some of those tools were from the 1950s. A Stanley plane that was my grandfather's first major tool purchase. A saw that he'd used on hundreds of job sites. They weren't just tools, they were family history. And now they're buried under concrete. Yes. Brenda Morrison was watching me from the defendant's table, her expression unreadable. Garrett Hughes Cross examined me, trying to suggest that I was exaggerating the value of the tools, that the shed wasn't really within my property lines despite the survey, that I should have responded to the notices that were supposedly sent. Isn't it true, Mr. Jamison, that you've had conflicts with the HOA in the past? No. Prior to this, I'd had zero interactions with the HOA beyond paying my fees. But you've been unhappy with certain community rules. I've never expressed any unhappiness with any rules. This is the first issue I've ever had. Yet you immediately hired an attorney and filed a lawsuit rather than trying to work things out. They destroyed my property. What was there to work out? Mitchell objected, and Judge Palmer sustained it, giving Garrett Hughes a warning look. Tom testified next, talking about his wife's garden, the roses that were irreplaceable. Maria took the stand after him, crying as she described the roses from her mother's garden. The other neighbors testified about their losses, their encounters with the HOA board, the harassment they'd faced. Day 2 included testimony from the construction foreman, who admitted that he'd had concerns about the property boundaries but was told by the HOA that it was all verified and approved. He'd assumed they'd done their due diligence. "Did you see any permits for the construction?" Mitchell asked. "No, sir. The HOA said they didn't need permits for internal community improvements." "Did that concern you?" "A little, but they seemed certain. I've worked for HOAs before that handle their own projects." "But you've never worked on a project where you were pouring concrete over residential backyards without permits?" "No, sir. That was a first." The HOA's property manager testified, clearly uncomfortable. She'd been the one to send out the notices about the parking project, but she admitted under questioning that the notices had been mailed only to residents who weren't directly affected. The homeowners whose property was being taken had never been notified. "Why not?" Mitchell asked. "I don't know. That's what the board told me to do. You didn't think it was strange to not notify the homeowners whose property you were about to build on. I thought maybe they'd been contacted separately. I assumed someone had talked to them. But you didn't verify that?" "No." The most damning testimony came from the HOA treasurer, a nervous man named Philip Chen, who clearly wished he was anywhere else. Under questioning, he revealed that he'd raised concerns about the property boundaries before the project started. "What specifically did you tell the board?" Mitchell asked. "I said we should get a current survey done before moving forward. The plat map we were using looked old, and I wanted to make sure we weren't building on private property." "What was the response?" "Brenda said it was fine. She said the plat map was official HOA documentation and we didn't need to spend money on a new survey." "Did you press the issue?" "I tried, but I was outvoted. The rest of the board wanted to move forward." "Why do you think that was?" Garrett Hughes objected, but Judge Palmer overruled it. She wanted to hear the answer. Philip Chen looked miserable. "I think they'd already committed to the project. The loan was approved, the contractor was lined up. They didn't want to hear anything that might delay or complicate things. So they ignored your concerns about potentially building on private property." "Yes." When Brenda Morrison took the stand, she was defiant. She maintained that the HOA had acted properly, that they'd followed their procedures, that the project was necessary for the community. "Do you accept any responsibility for what happened?" Mitchell asked. "I accept responsibility for trying to improve our community. If property lines were crossed, that's an unfortunate error, but it was done in good faith. Even after your treasurer warned you about the property boundaries." He expressed concerns. The board discussed them and decided to proceed. Without verifying the property lines, we had a plat map. A plat map from 2003 that didn't reflect current property boundaries. We believed it was accurate. "Did you ever compare it to county records?" A pause. "I don't recall." "Did you contact a surveyor?" "No." "Did you contact any of the affected homeowners before destroying their property?" "We sent out community notices." "But you didn't send notices to the actual property owners whose land you were taking." "I believed the property was common area." based on a 20-year-old plat map that you never verified. Brenda's composure was cracking. I did what I thought was best for the community. And when the property owners objected, you launched a campaign of harassment against them. Dozens of frivolous violations in a matter of weeks. Those were legitimate violations. Against only the people suing you, none against anyone else. That's coincidence, is it? Or was it retaliation? Garrett Hughes objected, but the damage was done. Brenda looked defensive, angry, cornered. The district attorney's investigator testified next, outlining what they'd found in their investigation. The loan application had listed 60,000 square feet of common area. The actual common area was 42,000 square feet. The difference was made up of private property that the HOA had falsely claimed to own. This wasn't a mistake, the investigator said. The loan required a certain amount of collateral. The HOA didn't have enough legitimate common area to qualify. So they added private property to the application, misrepresenting it as HOA-owned land. Who signed the loan application? Mitchell asked. Brenda Morrison, as HOA president, and Susan Whitmore, the HOA vice president. Did they know the property values were inflated? They had to. They had the actual plat maps in their files. They chose to use the old map because it served their purposes. That was it. That was the smoking gun. Not a mistake, not an oversight, deliberate fraud. Judge Palmer called a recess after that. When we came back, Garrett Hughes looked like he'd been in a fight. He requested a meeting with Mitchell, and they disappeared into a conference room with the judge. When they emerged 30 minutes later, Mitchell was wearing a small smile. They want to settle, he told me quietly. The HOA's insurance company is freaking out. They're offering full damages, restoration costs, and they're agreeing to resign from the board. What about criminal charges? That's not part of the settlement. The DA is proceeding independently. Then I want to settle. Get our money, get our property restored, and let them face justice. The settlement was finalized that afternoon. The HOA would pay each affected homeowner actual damages plus $50,000 in additional compensation. They would remove the parking lot at their expense and restore our properties as close to original condition as possible. Brenda Morrison, Susan Whitmore, and the other board members would resign immediately, and they would make a public statement acknowledging their wrongdoing. The total settlement was over $800,000, which would bankrupt the HOA's insurance policy and likely result in a special assessment to all homeowners to cover the remainder. But that wasn't our problem. They'd chosen to follow Brenda's leadership. Now they'd deal with the consequences. 2 weeks later, Brenda Morrison and Susan Whitmore were arrested and charged with fraud, filing false documents, and criminal trespass. The other board members received lesser charges for their roles. Brenda's mugshot made the local news, and I'd be lying if I said I didn't feel a sense of satisfaction seeing her shocked expression as she was led into the courthouse in handcuffs. The parking lot removal began in January. It was strange watching a crew tear up the same concrete another crew had poured just 4 months earlier. My yard was a mess of churned dirt and debris, but buried in that debris were pieces of my grandfather's tools. The excavation crew was careful, sifting through the rubble, recovering what they could. Some tools were salvaged. The Stanley plane was intact, protected by its wooden case. Several hand saws were bent but repairable. Others were destroyed beyond recognition, twisted metal and splintered wood. I cleaned each recovered tool carefully, treating them like archaeological artifacts. The restoration took 3 months. New sod, replanted gardens, rebuilt fences. My shed was reconstructed, bigger than before, with a concrete foundation and proper permits. The contractor the insurance company hired was professional and thorough, checking with me constantly to make sure everything was to my satisfaction. By April, my backyard looked better than it had before the whole ordeal. Tom's yard was restored, Maria's roses replanted with specimens from a specialty nursery in California. The other neighbors got their properties back too. The HOA elected a new board in March. They were younger, more transparent, committed to following the rules and respecting property rights. They implemented new procedures requiring board decisions to be documented, reviewed by an attorney, and communicated clearly to all affected parties. Brenda Morrison pleaded guilty to fraud and filing false documents in May. She got 2 years probation, community service, and a permanent ban from serving on any HOA board in Arizona. Susan Whitmore took a plea deal too, 18 months probation. The other board members got fines and probation. It wasn't the justice I'd imagined when I first saw my shed being destroyed. I'd fantasized about them going to prison, about dramatic courtroom confrontations. But watching Brenda stand before a judge and admit what she'd done, watching her privileged certainty crumble into humiliated acceptance of guilt, that was enough. I was in my new shed on a Saturday morning in June, working on a project with one of my grandfather's recovered saws, when Tom knocked on the door. "Hey, Quincy, got a minute?" "Sure, come in." He looked around the shed, impressed. "This is really nice. Better than before." "Yeah, the insurance company didn't skimp." "What's up?" "Maria and I wanted to thank you for not backing down, for fighting this. We never could have done it without you. We all fought together. But you started it. You could have taken their first settlement offer, cut your losses, moved on. Instead, you made them face consequences." He paused. "There's something else. The new HOA board wants to name the community garden after you, the one they're building where that illegal parking lot was supposed to go." I laughed. "I don't need a garden named after me. I know. But they want to do something. They're thinking the Jamison Community Garden, a place where people can grow vegetables, flowers, teach kids about gardening, something good coming from something bad. I thought about my grandfather, about his tools, about the whole mess. Okay, but on one condition. Put up a plaque that says something about respecting property rights and following the law. Make it a reminder. Deal." The Jamison Community Garden opened in August. It was on actual common area property this time, properly surveyed and permitted. The plaque read, "Dedicated to the principle that rules exist to serve the community, not to serve those in power. May we never forget the importance of respecting the rights of all homeowners." I attended the opening with Tom, Maria, and the other neighbors who'd fought alongside me. We planted the first vegetables together, tomatoes and peppers and squash. Kids ran around the garden beds, excited about the new space. People who'd been on opposite sides during the lawsuit came together for the first time in months. Brenda Morrison wasn't there, of course. Last I heard, she'd moved to Nevada, trying to start over somewhere her name wasn't associated with HOA fraud. I didn't waste energy thinking about her anymore. I went home that evening and stood in my backyard, looking at the restored grass, the new shed, the fence line that clearly marked my property. It had been almost a year since that Friday morning when my world had turned into a nightmare of destroyed property and legal battles. The fight had cost me time, stress, sleep, and peace of mind. But it had also taught me something important. When someone in power tries to take what's yours, you have to fight back. Not with violence, not with vandalism, but with documentation, attorneys, and the legal system. It's slow, it's frustrating, it's expensive, but it works. My grandfather's tools sat on the workbench in my new shed, the ones that had been recovered, cleaned, and restored. They'd been buried under concrete, written off as lost. But we dug them up, brought them back, gave them new purpose. Maybe that was the real lesson. You can't always stop bad things from happening. Sometimes people in power will abuse that power, will destroy what you've built, will try to intimidate you into submission. But if you stand your ground, if you fight back with truth and documentation and persistence, you can win. You can dig up what was buried, restore what was destroyed, and make sure it never happens again. I picked up the Stanley plane, my grandfather's first major tool purchase, and ran my hand over the smooth wood. It had survived. We'd all survived, and the HOA would never forget the lesson we'd taught them about respecting property rights and the rule of law. I got back to my woodworking project, a bookshelf for Tom and Maria's daughter. The saw cut through the wood with satisfying precision. My grandfather's tool still sharp after all these years, still doing the job it was made for. Outside, the Arizona sun was setting, casting long shadows across my restored backyard. The nightmare was over. Justice had been served, and life finally was getting back to normal. The legal bills had been covered by the settlement, my property was restored, and the criminals had faced consequences. It was as close to a perfect ending as real life ever provides. Sometimes I still got angry thinking about that Friday morning, about watching my shed being destroyed, about Brenda Morrison's condescending smile as she dismissed my concerns. But mostly, I felt grateful. Grateful for neighbors who stood together, for an attorney who fought hard, for a judge who saw through the HOA's bullshit, and for a legal system that, despite its flaws, ultimately worked. The next HOA meeting was scheduled for the following week. I was planning to attend, not to cause trouble, but to participate in my community like a normal homeowner. The new board had requested input on various initiatives, and I had ideas about property line verification procedures that might prevent future disasters. Tom was going too. So were most of our neighbors. We'd learned that ignoring your HOA doesn't make problems go away. Engagement, oversight, and accountability were the real solutions. As I finished working for the day and locked up my shed, I noticed a car slowing down in front of my house. For a moment, old paranoia kicked in. Was someone casing the place? Another HOA problem, but it was just a family looking at houses in the neighborhood. The father pointed at the community garden visible down the street. The kids in the back seat pressed their faces to the window, excited about something. Our property values had actually gone up after the lawsuit, not down like Brenda had predicted. Turns out people liked buying into a community where homeowner rights were protected and the board was held accountable. Who knew? I went inside, made dinner, and spent the evening relaxing. No angry emails from the HOA, no threatening letters, no construction crews destroying my property. Just a quiet Tuesday evening in Scottsdale, Arizona. It was perfect. The next morning I got a call from Mitchell. "Quincy, got some news you'll want to hear. The HOA's insurance company is suing Brenda Morrison and the other former board members personally to recover what they paid out in the settlement. They're going after her assets, her house, everything." Good. There's more. Apparently the FBI got involved because of the loan fraud. It crossed state lines because the bank that issued the loan was based in Colorado. They're looking at federal charges now, possible prison time. I sat down. Seriously? Yeah, turns out when you commit fraud to obtain hundreds of thousands of dollars, the feds take interest. Especially when it's part of a pattern. They're investigating whether she did similar things at previous HOAs she was involved with. Was she looking like it? She served on HOA boards in 3 different states over the past 15 years. They're reviewing records from all of them. After we hung up, I just sat there for a while, processing. What had started as a property dispute over my tool shed had uncovered something much bigger. Brenda Morrison hadn't been a local tyrant who got carried away with power. She was a serial fraudster who'd been using HOAs as her personal piggy banks for over a decade. How many other homeowners had suffered because of her? How many other properties had been taken, rights violated, lives disrupted? I hoped they all got justice too. The months rolled on. Summer turned to fall, fall to winter. The community garden thrived, producing vegetables that were donated to local food banks. The HOA functioned smoothly under new leadership, handling maintenance and community issues without drama or overreach. I finished the bookshelf for Tom and Maria's daughter and started new projects. A dining table for my own place, a jewelry box for my sister's birthday, a rocking chair just because I felt like building one. My grandfather's tools worked as well as they ever had, passed down through generations, surviving even burial under concrete. Every time I used them, I thought about him, about the legacy of craftsmanship he'd given me. In February, almost a year and a half after the nightmare began, I received notice that the federal charges against Brenda Morrison had resulted in a conviction. She got 5 years in federal prison for wire fraud, bank fraud, and conspiracy. The other former board members got lesser sentences for their roles. I didn't celebrate. There was no joy in watching people go to prison, even people who'd hurt me. But there was satisfaction in knowing justice had been served, that the system had worked, that powerful people faced consequences for abusing that power. The HOA world is strange. These little fiefdoms scattered across America, with boards that wield enormous power over people's homes and lives, often with minimal oversight or accountability. Most operate fairly and legally, but some, like ours had under Brenda's leadership, become vehicles for petty tyranny or outright crime. What happened to me could happen to anyone. One day you're living your life, and the next day someone in power is destroying your property, violating your rights, and telling you there's nothing you can do about it. But there is something you can do. You can document everything. You can hire an attorney. You can fight back through the legal system. It's not easy, it's not quick, but it works. I became something of a local expert on HOA disputes after my case. People called asking for advice. I referred them to Mitchell, shared my experiences, encouraged them to stand up for their rights. A local news station did a feature about HOA reform, and I was interviewed about what happened. The story spread beyond Phoenix. I got emails from people in other states facing similar issues. HOA boards taking property, violating rules, retaliating against homeowners who complained. I couldn't help them all, but I tried to point them toward resources, toward attorneys who specialized in HOA law, toward the documentation and persistence that had saved me. In March, the Arizona legislature passed new laws strengthening homeowner protections against HOA overreach. The law required HOAs to carry adequate insurance, mandated independent audits of HOA finances, and created penalties for board members who deliberately violated property rights. It was nicknamed the Jamison Law in some circles, though officially it was just House Bill 2847. I testified at a legislative committee hearing before the bill passed, telling my story to a room full of state representatives. Some of them had their own HOA horror stories. Everyone, it seemed, knew someone who'd been screwed over by an out-of-control board. The law passed unanimously. It wouldn't fix everything, but it was a start. By the time spring arrived again, 2 years after the initial incident, life had fully normalized. My shed was just my shed, a place to work on projects and store tools. My yard was just my yard, no longer a battlefield or crime scene. The HOA was just an HOA, handling common area maintenance and enforcing reasonable rules. Tom and Maria invited me over for dinner one evening. We sat on their back patio, looking out at the yard that had been destroyed and then restored, drinking beer and watching the sunset. "You ever regret moving here?" Tom asked. I thought about it. No, what happened was terrible, but it could have happened anywhere. At least here we fixed it. We made things better. Think it'll stick? The new board, the reforms, all of it? I don't know, but we'll be watching, all of us. That's the real lesson. You can't just trust that people in power will do the right thing. You have to pay attention, ask questions, hold them accountable. Maria raised her beer. To accountability. We clinked bottles and drank. Later that night, I stood in my shed one more time, looking at my grandfather's tools hanging on the wall. Each one had a story. The plane he'd bought with his first real paycheck. The saw he'd used to build his own house. The level that had traveled with him to job sites across Chicago for 4 decades. And now they had a new story. The story of being buried and recovered, of surviving destruction, of being part of something bigger than just carpentry. I picked up the plane and examined it in the light. There were new scratches on the body, marks from the concrete and the excavation. Battle scars. But it still worked perfectly, the blade sharp, the mechanism smooth. Like me, it had been through hell and come out functional on the other side. I put the plane back on its shelf and turned off the lights. Tomorrow I'd start a new project, something ambitious. Maybe a full bedroom set or a display cabinet or a desk. Something that would take months to complete, requiring patience and precision and care. That was the thing about woodworking and maybe about life too. You can't rush it. You have to measure carefully, cut precisely, sand thoroughly. You have to respect the materials, the tools, the process. And when something goes wrong, when a cut is bad or a joint doesn't fit, you have to fix it properly, not cover it up and hope nobody notices. Brenda Morrison had tried to cover up her fraud, to bulldoze over property rights and hope nobody fought back. It hadn't worked. The truth had come out, justice had been served, and she was in prison. Sometimes the good guys win. Not always, not easily, but sometimes. I walked back to my house under the stars, feeling more at peace than I had in years. The nightmare was over. The fight was won. And life, against all odds, had turned out okay. My phone buzzed with a text from Mitchell. Former board members lost their appeal, convictions upheld. It's really over. I replied with a thumbs-up emoji and went inside. It was really over, and that finally was enough.